Dunbar, Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, "Go on, Janey," and another said, "There she goes." "We're next," Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hand. Turning them over and over nervously, Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together. Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. "Harbert!" "Hutchinson!" "Get up there, Bill!" Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. "Jones, they do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old Man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said, listening to the young folks. "Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves, nobody work any more, live hat way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries." Mrs. Adams said, "Nothing but trouble in that." Old Man Warner said stoutly, "Pack of young fools." "Martin." And Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. "Overdyke." "Percy." "I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. "You get ready to run tell Dad." Mrs. Dunbar said, Mr. Summers called his own name, and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner." "77th year I been in the lottery," Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. "77th time." "Watson." The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, "Don't be nervous, Jack." And Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son. Zanini." After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saving, "Who is it?" "Who's got it?" "Is it the Dunbars?" "Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson." "It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said. "That was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance. Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe." Bill Hutchinson said regretfully, "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair, and I've got no other family except the kids." "Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too." "Right, right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. "3," Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill, Junior, and Nancy, and little Dave, and Tessie and me." All right, then, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back. Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box, then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's and put it in. I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. I tell you it wasn't fair.